January 2023, the US announces it's sending 31 M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, America's most advanced main battle tank, the stuff of Desert Storm legend. These things had crushed Iraqi forces, dominated battlefields across the Middle East, and earned a reputation as basically unstoppable. Ukraine and its allies were pumped, finally the game-changing weapon that would break Russian lines and turn the tide of the war. 6 months later, 20 out of those 31 tanks were destroyed, damaged, or captured. Russian troops were posing for selfies with knocked-out Abrams in Moscow, and US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was quietly admitting the tanks had limited utility on the Ukrainian battlefield. What the heck happened? How did America's most legendary tank go from game changer to expensive target practice in less than half a year? This is the story of one of the biggest reality checks in modern military history. Let's set the scene. It's early 2023, and Ukraine is begging for heavy armor. They've been fighting Russians for nearly a year with Soviet-era junk and whatever NATO countries could spare. The counter-offensive is coming, and they need something with serious firepower. Enter the M1 Abrams, 70 tons of American engineering excellence. This thing packs a 120mm smoothbore cannon, advanced fire control systems, and armor that's supposed to shrug off everything short of a nuclear blast. It had dominated every battlefield it touched, from the Gulf War to Iraq. The Americans were confident, the Ukrainians were thrilled, military analysts were calling it a potential game changer. Finally, Ukraine would have a tank that could go toe-to-toe with anything Russia could field. President Biden himself announced the decision, saying these tanks would enhance Ukraine's ability to defend itself from Russian attacks. The message was clear. America was sending its best, and it was going to make a difference. 31 tanks, 1 battalion's worth. Not a huge number, but these weren't just any tanks. These were M1A1 Abrams with modern digital systems, the most advanced and lethal tank Ukraine would get its hands on. What could possibly go wrong? Here's the first hint that maybe this wasn't going to go as planned. US defense officials were already warning that the Abrams wouldn't be an easy option for Ukrainian forces. The logistical complexity was insane. These tanks don't just run on diesel like most vehicles. They're powered by gas turbine engines that guzzle fuel like nobody's business. They need specialized spare parts, specific ammunition, and maintenance procedures that require extensive training. It's not like handing someone a pickup truck. Operating an M1 Abrams effectively requires years of training. The US Army spends months just teaching crews how to maintain these things properly. But Ukraine was in the middle of a war. They didn't have years. They had weeks to figure out how to operate, maintain, and supply one of the world's most complex battle tanks. While Russian artillery was raining down on them, the Americans tried to help. They provided spare parts, additional equipment, and training programs, but the training was rushed. Ukrainian crews got limited time to understand and master a vehicle that usually takes American tankers months to learn properly. The M1A1 variant sent to Ukraine was genuinely impressive on paper. 1,500 horsepower gas turbine engine, top speed of 67.5 kilometers per hour, operational range of 1,500 kilometers. The 120mm smoothbore cannon could fire armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds capable of destroying pretty much anything the Russians had. For defense, it had a 12.7mm heavy machine gun and a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun. The armor was robust, the electronic systems were sophisticated. By most measures, this was one of the most formidable combat vehicles in the world. But here's the catch. The versions sent to Ukraine were downgraded. No depleted uranium armor like the US Army uses. No cutting-edge combat systems. No active protection systems that are standard on European tanks like the Israeli Merkava or German Leopard 2. Active protection systems can detect and intercept incoming threats before they strike, essential defense against drones and missiles. Without them, the Abrams relied solely on passive armor, leaving them more exposed to the kind of attacks that were becoming common in Ukraine. The tanks also lacked the advanced electronic warfare suites that might help against the drone-heavy battlefield Ukraine had become. And let's not forget, these tanks are not invincible. What you saw right there was one of the first times an M1 Abrams took critical damage during the Iraq War from an RPG-29. 2 crew members died, but the tank stayed operational after, and that was just from a single man-portable anti-tank weapon. Here's where the story gets really ugly. The Ukraine-Russia conflict had quickly become one of the most drone-heavy battles in modern history. We're talking about everything from reconnaissance drones to kamikaze drones to FPV racing drones converted into flying bombs. Among these, the Russian Piranha FPV drone had gained particular attention. This thing costs about $500 to build using commercially available parts. It's small, agile, and highly effective at targeting high-value assets, like multi-million-dollar American tanks. Russian military analysts reported that the majority of the 14 M1A1 Abrams tanks destroyed in the first few months were taken out by FPV and suicide drones. Let that sink in. $500 drones were consistently killing $10 million tanks. If I recall correctly, the first M1 Abrams destroyed came in February 2024. The 15th Motor Rifle Brigade of Russian forces used a Piranha drone to execute what's called an M-kill maneuver, targeting the tank's engine or tracks to disable its mobility. The drone, controlled through multiple jamming-resistant radio frequencies, found its mark. There's actually video footage of this first destruction available online, and it's pretty sobering to watch. Within a week, other Abrams tanks in the same region were destroyed in similar fashion. The Russians had found their hunting grounds, and they were exploiting them. Brigadier General Jeffrey Norman hit the nail on the head when he identified the core problem. The Abrams is designed to withstand direct hits from tanks and armored vehicles, but it's far less prepared for top-down attacks. The tank's armor is heaviest on the front and sides. That's where enemy tank rounds were expected to come from. But the roof? Relatively exposed. And that's exactly where drones like to attack. FPV and kamikaze drones typically target critical components like engines and turrets from above. The Abrams, for all its legendary armor, simply wasn't designed for this threat environment. Meanwhile, Ukrainian crews were trying to adapt. They wrapped steel cages around tanks for added protection, but these proved largely ineffective. The cages might delay destruction, but couldn't prevent fatal damage from determined drone attacks. Even when the tanks weren't getting blown up, they were breaking down. Ukrainian officials complained about poor durability of electronic components, particularly their vulnerability to condensation and harsh weather conditions. The complex electronic systems that made the Abrams so advanced also made them fragile in Ukrainian battlefield conditions. Extreme weather, constant vibration from artillery bombardments, and the general chaos of combat were wreaking havoc on sensitive components. When electronic systems failed, the tank could become non-operational even if the armor and main gun were intact. It's like having a Ferrari with a broken computer. All that horsepower doesn't matter if the electronics won't let the engine start. The maintenance requirements were also crushing Ukrainian logistics. These tanks needed specialized tools, specific lubricants, and replacement parts that had to be shipped from the United States. In a fast-moving battlefield where supply lines were constantly under attack, keeping the Abrams running became a logistical nightmare. By April 2024, the writing was on the wall. At least 5 Abrams had been destroyed in a 2-month span, taken out by swarms of cheap Russian drones. Ukrainian officials made the difficult decision to pull the remaining tanks from the front lines for re-evaluation. Think about that for a second. The most advanced tank in the American arsenal, sent to Ukraine with great fanfare and high expectations, had to be withdrawn from combat because it couldn't survive on the modern battlefield. Jake Sullivan's admission that the Abrams had limited utility was diplomatic speak for "these things are getting wrecked and we don't know how to fix it." The loss rate was staggering. 20 out of 31 tanks destroyed, damaged, or captured within 6 months of deployment. Some were destroyed in combat, others were captured by Russian forces and are now displayed as trophies in Moscow. At this point, almost all of the US donated Abrams have been destroyed, and the vast majority of those losses came from drone attacks. The Abrams failure in Ukraine reveals something uncomfortable about modern military technology. Weapons systems designed for one type of warfare don't automatically translate to different threat environments. The M1 Abrams was designed during the Cold War to fight Soviet tank formations on European plains. It excelled in Desert Storm against Iraqi forces using similar Soviet-designed equipment and tactics. But Ukraine in 2024 was a completely different battlefield. Drone warfare had fundamentally changed the equation. When $500 commercial drones can consistently kill $10 million tanks, traditional armor doctrine needs serious rethinking. The training issue was also crucial. Operating an Abrams effectively requires not just knowing how to drive and shoot, but understanding maintenance, logistics, tactical employment, and electronic systems. Ukrainian crews, no matter how motivated, simply didn't have enough time to master all these aspects. And here's the thing that really gets me. The US has thousands of various older model M1 tanks. There are literally 3,000 to 4,000 of them rusting away in Nevada. We've had years to set this up properly. I never understood why we didn't immediately start an armor school in Poland to train Ukrainians on tanks and tank maintenance. It takes a long time to get these older vehicles working, but we've had 3 or 4 times that long to prepare. Every year, hundreds of US Army and Marine tankers retire in their early 40s with nothing to do but find a second career. The best of the best could have been hired to run an armor school as non-combatants, all for less than the cost of a few jet fighters. Instead, we rushed the whole thing when the war was already underway. The logistics tail was another killer. Modern Western tanks require enormous support networks, specialized fuel, ammunition, spare parts, maintenance equipment, and trained technicians. Ukraine's military infrastructure wasn't set up for this level of complexity. The Abrams experience in Ukraine is teaching military planners some hard lessons about modern warfare. First, passive armor alone isn't enough anymore. Active protection systems that can intercept incoming threats are becoming essential, not optional. We've seen the Israeli trophy system and similar technologies are proving their worth against drone and missile attacks. Second, the drone threat is real and growing. Military vehicles need to be designed with top-down attacks in mind, not just direct fire from other vehicles. Third, complexity is a vulnerability. The more sophisticated a weapon system, the more things can go wrong and the more specialized support it needs. And in chaotic battlefield conditions, simpler might be better. Fourth, training time matters. You can't just hand someone an advanced weapons system and expect them to use it effectively without proper preparation. The learning curve for modern military equipment is steep and unforgiving. The M1 Abrams struggles in Ukraine are part of a larger story about how warfare is evolving faster than military doctrine can keep up. Traditional armor, designed for conventional warfare between nation-states, is struggling against asymmetric threats like drone swarms. The same issues are affecting other Western tanks. German Leopards and British Challengers have also taken heavy losses in Ukraine. This doesn't really mean tanks are obsolete, but it does mean they need to be employed differently and protected better. For Ukraine, the Abrams experience has been a costly lesson. The tanks that were supposed to be game changers became expensive targets. For the US military, it's a wake-up call about the realities of modern battlefield conditions. The weapons that dominated past conflicts might not be suitable for future ones, at least not without some major changes. In hindsight, maybe this outcome is better for everyone involved. The Americans sell these tanks for about $10 million apiece. That's some $300 million for the 30 tanks, and it's absolutely not worth the money. You can get 3,000 to 5,000 FPV drones for the price of a single Abrams tank, and that's money much better spent. When it comes to inflicting damage on the enemy, I'd rather have 1,000 drones than one Abrams tank. When you send a weapon system designed for Cold War tank battles into a drone-dominated environment, bad things happen. When you don't have time to properly train operators or establish logistics networks, even the best equipment becomes vulnerable. Like I said before, this ultimately comes down to adaptation, or the failure to adapt quickly enough. Warfare evolves constantly, and military technology that doesn't keep pace gets left behind. The tank crews who died in knocked-out Abrams weren't victims of bad equipment. They were victims of a mismatch between the tools they were given and the threats they faced. Their sacrifice is teaching lessons that will hopefully prevent similar losses in the future. Interestingly, Australia recently sent around 49 older, aging Abrams tanks to Ukraine, apparently with better armor than the American versions. It'll be interesting to see how they perform against the same drone threats that devastated the US tanks. So that about wraps it up for the situation of America's legendary M1 Abrams tanks struggling in Ukraine. I'll be making updates later to see how the newer M1 Abrams from Australia performs. Hope you got something out of this and learned about the gap between military hype and battlefield reality. But if you think this situation is bad, we've also covered how the Russian T-72s are doing and how tragic it can be to operate one of those, so you can see how the Russians are also dealing with struggles of their own And if you could throw us a like, that'd be awesome. It genuinely helps small channels like ours actually reach people who enjoy this kind of content. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.